Now, we all know in Australia, we hear about what happened in Christchurch and what went on. A lot of our New Zealand users, of course, lived through it. We thought, especially for those of you here who come from that technical side of design, surveying and things, you will understand just how bad it was. You show photos and things to the layman and, oh yeah, so what, the building moved a metre. Oh, just put it back. But you're the sort of audience who understands exactly what it means to talk about how the earthquake went and really what the damage does, and to think about how you would reconstruct for it. So that's the first presentation we'll start off with. There's Sam Cech. There's Sam hiding down there. Just to show you some things about the earthquake itself. And then we'll have a case study from the SCIRT team. And this is the team that was brought together to try and rebuild Christchurch over the next, well, they're doing quite a bit of it in 5 years, but I think it'll be going for a lot longer. So I'll hand over to Sam, and he'll actually then introduce the SCIRT team for their part of this morning's presentation. So Sam, it's all yours.
Thank you, Lee. I did the right thing last night. I got a text message from Lane. Not sure where he's sitting, but he was telling me he's in a, I think it was Irish pub, wasn't it? I didn't go. So I can be here and talk to you. Unfortunately, I picked up a bit of a cold. So apart from the Czechoslovakian accent, you're getting a bit of a sniffle and nose there as well. So apologies for that. Christchurch earthquakes. I was talking to an engineer, Nigel, from the City Council. He's sitting in the audience here. You can talk to him later. About how are we going to make this presentation different from what you may have seen already in SSI and engineering institutes and landscape and everyone else. And how do we bring it home, and how do we actually talk about earthquakes and convey that to people that haven't experienced them. And I understand if you're from Melbourne, you probably have. And if you're from Christchurch, you have as well. But I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to ask the gentleman in the back to dim the lights in a moment. And if you guys can, together with me, just close your eyes for a moment. We're going to play you a little audio. And I'll introduce it for you as the lights go down. It was 22nd of February, just before 1 p.m. and lecture theatre, similar to this one. And if you go back to your student days, and the peers beside you are students at the University of Canterbury.
They say it's got to be factual forward. It can't be factual forward.
I've cut the audio short there for you. We can put the lights back up. That was, sorry, I can't help but every time you hear it, it brings memories back. And I guess this presentation, if we can leave you with a bit of a tear in your eye, but hope at the end when the SCIRT guys come on top, up here to talk about the rebuild, is the goal we want to achieve. That was 200 students listening to land law, advanced land law lecture at the university. And that was the February 22nd earthquake. But it all started year before, 4th of September, about 4:35 a.m. and 5 seconds. And I always get teased because I stayed in bed. I covered up in a blanket, and I just couldn't believe that there was a freight train, a jet engine, something in the house shaking it to bits. 22nd of February, I was in the office talking to a accounts lady, Lynn. She was telling me asking advice on an invoice. And next thing we know, we were underneath my desk in a very awkward position, thrown thrown up and down into the walls, into the desk, into the legs of the desk, and it was just computers flying everywhere, the paper, my cell phone, keys, everything. When it stopped, we looked outside and there was just dust and paper outside. It was silent. I could hear colleagues yelling out, "Is everyone okay?" We got out into the corridor. A few people weren't taking it very well and stuff. I got blinkers on and just ran downstairs and ran home. And the rest of the day is a bit of a blur, and I'd rather keep it that way. I don't want to remember too much. June 13, there was a massive pre-quake, 5.9, about an hour earlier. And I was in the office, and that got us all out of the warehouse and got on the cell phones. But of course what happens in these quakes is cell phone towers are knocked out, so you can't get hold of your loved ones. I jumped in the car, drove home, only to find my wife and then year and a bit old daughter in the living room just crying and being in the middle there trying to be safe. We went around the block and we just sort of checked on neighbors and making sure everyone was okay. And we were talking about bloody insurance claims we had to go and lodge. And for those 40 people from Christchurch, you know how difficult it is to deal with EQC and insurance companies. And of course, that's when the 6.0 hit. And for the first time, I was outside. And hearing that noise and just the cliffs falling into the sea, the scaffolding bending and twisting, the Woolston shops, mainly made of brick buildings, just collapsing and falling down. And the neighbor's kitchen that we were standing next to being shaken to bits, like a box with broken glass. It was just amazing. And even that audio doesn't do it justice. And I spent the rest of that year basically wondering why was that 7.1 magnitude quake so much stronger, so much bigger, but yet caused less devastation than these other major events we've had. The scientists go about and educating the public, and they come and tell us all about all these different scales by which they measure earthquakes. I've never knew about intensities and G-forces and what have you else. But essentially all our earthquakes have been off the scale that previously has been set. 9, 10, violent shaking, heavy damage, extreme and very extreme heavy damage. The way this translates to the quakes we've had, CBD area and the earthquake epicenter experienced the ground accelerations and of over 2 Gs, both for the February and June event. Now, to understand, the epicenter of these quakes is actually underneath residential area. Some really, really expensive hillside suburbs have been completely destroyed by these quakes. Bricks flown off the buildings, tiles flew off the roofs. And the building code that has a threshold for designing against the acceleration is set quite low. And even the maximum building code is at a level below the forces we've experienced. And it would be just simply impractical and uneconomical to build anything to withstand 2.2 G. The G-forces, it's a strange little measurement. It equates the horizontal G-force you experience, just as if you are in an airplane and bends very tightly, or in a car driving a Formula One, as I know you all do on the weekend. And then there's the G-force that's straight up. And most of these earthquakes, we got 2 Gs just straight up through the earth. And unless you're attached to the bedrock, all that's going to happen to you, you're going to come up and you're going to drop down. So I went about, if you don't know it, Google it. So I went on Google and tried to get some sense out of why these quakes have been so violent and what other earthquakes have been there that caused similar damage and what magnitude they have been. And the Japanese quake that caused huge tsunami and devastation in Japan last year was almost 3 G. But the only other quake I could find anywhere near 2 G was the 1994 Californian quake. That probably explains why the scales sort of end at about 1.6 G. The September earthquake has caused wide damage in all of at the epicenter, which is Selwyn District. It's out in a rural area. Twisted metal railways, shunted fences 4 meters plus, and you've probably seen lots of images about these in the past. It's caused huge amounts of damage in the city, especially in the liquefaction-prone areas, and generally caused about $2 billion worth of damage that was going to be repaired in a reasonable good time. When 22nd of February hit, this is the effect of G-forces coming straight up through the ground. The columns that support buildings, concrete steel reinforced columns, they get hit from underneath. The compression of a building happens. The building lifts. As they fall back down, the compression happens again. And your structural weight-bearing columns fail in a spectacular fashion. Unfortunately, 185 people have lost their lives that day, mainly in these two buildings. And they will be missed. They are missed every day. I think everyone knows someone who's lost someone and is affected by the collapse of these buildings. The suburbs of Christchurch, especially the eastern suburbs, have been affected by huge amounts of liquefaction. It's a material that's underneath the road, and unlike a flood, even though the image on the right-hand side may look like a flood, it's basically material coming from underneath the road and bubbles up through small little pockets, little volcanoes, bubbles up onto the surface and destabilizes that ground. This goes through anything, any crack in the concrete, goes into shops, malls, supermarkets, just gets straight through and stinks of syrup. That compromises the road carriageway, and hundreds and thousands of cars have gone through in those weeks after the quake through the road carriageway. And this infrastructure had to be rebuilt pretty quickly. You can imagine our city is now a city of cones. We have more road cones than the whole entire New Zealand has ever had. I think we've imported them from Australia, everywhere else. I don't even know if there's any more road cones left in the world. Who is behind the rebuild? Essentially, government has got its local councils, creating an agency called CERA and a rebuild team called SCIRT. That's SCIRT with a C, don't Google SCIRT with a K. The commercial buildings are mainly repaired by insurance companies and insurance payouts. I'm not going to go into the details of your insurance policy being a replacement versus indemnity and what causes and how much it's going to cost you if you have an event. But the residential buildings have been insured throughout Texas as part of EQC as long as you have insurance on your house and you're covered for $100,000, I think. And after that, the insurance company takes over, which is very little relief for most people when it takes 4 or 5 years to get anywhere. But these are the different organizations looking after the rebuild. Just out of interest, New Zealand Crown budget is about 57 odd billion. The local council's combined budget is about 500 million. And by the end of June, the June event, the total cost of the earthquakes was ranging between 25 and 30 billion. So there is a lot of work to be done and a lot of money to be spent. But before we can go on and rebuild, we still have to demolish what's up there and is unsafe. There's a snapshot of the CBD. There's a website run by Sarah. Every single blue dot is a building marked for demolition. Every green dot is a building that's going to be made safe. And red dots are partial demolishments or demolishments that have been carried out to date. At the end of this period of work, there will be 67 buildings left in CBD. Previously had 1,100 buildings. The roads, the road damage and the infrastructure around Christchurch. There is a huge number of roadworks, road closures. You almost have to check the website before you go to work the next day. It's incredible. Prior to this website being up and running, the City Council was using all kinds of paper methods to manage this. And as you could imagine, it made it quite exciting driving through town. You go one road closure, detour. Oops, road closure, detour. They weren't talking to each other. They were just closing streets and working on them, quickly repair what they can. Luckily, they very quickly wisened up to it and spent huge amounts of money putting this website together. And everyone can go there and find out what roads are closed. We have been involved on a number of interesting projects. As Lee said, I got involved with a bit of laser scanning. We scanned the whole entire art center, series of 39 buildings made from stone. After that project, we also gone and scanned the cathedral, the icon of the city, before it had to be partially demolished due to safety. The point clouds that we've managed to load into 12D and work with Alan on lace strings and LiDAR and what have you, have been given to the church. There's Anglican Church. In my trial run, I think I've given the credit to Catholic Church, and I don't think they would have been very pleased with that. But it's a very detailed 2 by 2 centimeter point cloud of the church, and the hope is we can rebuild something that will be just as big of an icon for our city as this cathedral has been. LiDAR datasets that have been heavily used by the SCIRT team and engineers in 12D to do their analysis pre-post-quake shifts and flooding and so on, have been obtained after every major event. So there's 5 datasets. Luckily, the City Council has flown the city in 2003. This dataset is just showing the heights. So the red areas are the hills, and give you the indication on how steep some of our hills are. There's about 200 meters height difference. And the blue areas are basically low-lying areas of the city. The city is extremely flat and prone to liquefaction. Our ports have been heavily damaged, especially the Lyttelton port. However, it remained open throughout the entire 2 years, even though it's on the reclaimed land and suffered huge amounts of settlement and shift, while the bedrock, there's the area of the Port Hills that has uplifted, it's about 80 mil down at the sea level, about 300 mil at the top of the hills. But it remained open, and that sort of summarizes our environment in the city. We are open for business. We are there and doing things. There's the building, and there's the room that I was in on 22nd of February. The building has sustained damage during the quake. It moved half a meter southeast. It dropped about a half a meter, and the roof of the building twisted away from its foundations by a couple of 100 mil. After probably 9 months of assessments, the building owner decided it was uneconomical to repair and had it demolished. Of course, we moved out the day after the quake, and this was our office for a couple of weeks. 20-odd surveyors were working out of this garage. One of our staff members, Bob, was our tea lady. 6 o'clock in the morning, he would rock up there, knock on his door. He'll have a tea in his hand and say, "Hey, here you go." We load up, get out in the field, do our work, come back, 8 o'clock at night. He had another cup of tea with Bob, and we go home. Do the same thing the next day. Luckily, we managed to find accommodation, which is quite hard to find for business these days. It's an old sort of probably a warehouse or something like that. It housed 30 people, and with a couple of portacoms, we managed to squeeze 75 people in there. I can tell you we are very close. We always have been very close, but especially me and Lynn, not quite this close. We also have had amazing snowfalls. The last couple of years, we've had above average snowfalls in Christchurch. And the city is not built for snow. And the weakened structures after the earthquakes can't necessarily hold the snow on the roofs. The neighborhood I live in, Woolston, used to have 6 gas stations, petrol stations. After the earthquakes, we were down to 3. Then they closed the 3rd one. The snow came and the roof collapsed on one of them. So now we have 1 petrol station. So the rule in my household is that we fill up in the west side of town, which is where I work, and we never leave the car empty, go empty and go home. Because if there is an event at night, there's 1 gas station in the suburb, and if we can't get petrol, we can't get out. So how are we all coping in Christchurch? There has been 7,500 people relocated from red zone areas that will not be allowed to be built on again. Some of them live in tents and camper vans, and some people are in the white zone, undecided zone. 20,000 people have left the region, mainly for Australia. You guys enjoy. But I can't blame them. I mean, the horrific days and the ongoing events that happen in Christchurch, you just can't blame people taking it that way. And half the people who are left will probably tell you they're only there because they feel that they're somehow attached to their mortgage and the insurance claim, and they haven't got a choice. But as time goes on and we are rebuilding, we are finding ways to sort of cope. The ambulance services have dispatched paramedics in their own vehicles, for example. So every neighborhood now has a paramedic who can respond within 5 minutes to an event, whereas the ambulance will probably take half an hour to get to you through the city. The hospital has been damaged, and all the hospitals have been damaged, so there's a lot lower capacity. You will get sent to a local GP if you go to the hospital with something minor. However, we are all coping with that. We're finding ways to get through. The one thing I would like to do is to play you the end of that audio that I showed you in the beginning. The reason for that is, and it's a little bit hard to hear, so just listen out for the lecturer getting back onto the mic. It sort of summarizes Cantabrians and what they wanted to do and how they want to live. We'll leave the lights on for this one. Basically, the lecture just began 10 minutes prior to the quake, and the normality returned to the students pretty quickly. It says that we will rebuild the city, we will stay strong, and we will cope. And the guys at SCIRD are doing an amazing job at putting up the infrastructure and rebuilding the city, getting our sewer systems, water systems, and everything back together.